"This is a joke, right?" That's exactly what Chief Engineer James Reynolds muttered when he saw who had volunteered to fix the complex Rolls-Royce MT-30 engine of the modern USS Freedom, docked at the San Diego Naval Base. Its international mission scheduled to depart in just 48 hours. Its fate resting entirely on that seemingly impossible-to-repair engine. Admiral Reynolds watched as the elderly veteran slowly walked toward the damaged machinery. Isaac Wilson, now in his 80s, was at the base that day to witness his grandson's first day of service in the U.S. Navy. While waiting for his grandson's platoon to march past the docked ship, he overheard the Admiral ask, "Who can fix this complex engine?" The maintenance hangar at the San Diego Naval Base had never experienced such a heavy silence. Bright lights reflected off the massive Rolls-Royce MT-30 engine. Small clouds of steam quietly escaped from a side valve, visible evidence of the abnormal internal pressure that had left the Navy's best engineers completely baffled. "Admiral, with all due respect," said Chief Engineer Reynolds, objecting. "This engine has computerized diagnostic systems that didn't even exist 10 years ago. It's cutting-edge technology that requires specific certifications and all of you," Admiral Caldwell interrupted, pointing at Reynolds and his fellow engineers, "have all those certifications and still haven't been able to identify the problem. Let this gentleman at least take a look." The veteran, Isaac Wilson, gave a slight nod of gratitude to the Admiral. At 80 years old, his piercing eyes fixed on the engine with a familiarity that bordered on affection. "This is insane," muttered the youngest engineer, Duncan, to the colleague beside him. "What's he gonna do, talk to the engine? Ask it nicely to start running?" Some of the sailors exchanged uneasy glances. Most were young enough to be the man's grandsons. How could someone from his generation possibly understand a propulsion system filled with sensors, electro-hydraulic valves, and computerized control units? Wilson stopped about 2 feet from the engine, tilting his head slightly as if he were listening to a distant melody. His fingers, marked by decades of labor, gently brushed the metal surface near the axial compressor. He closed his eyes for a moment. "Irregular temperature in the 3rd section," Wilson said quietly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Did you check the airflow through the high-pressure compressor intake?" "Obviously," Reynolds replied with an impatient sigh. "All temperature sensors are within normal parameters. The onboard computers show no thermal anomalies." Wilson opened his eyes and slowly circled the engine, his boots echoing across the polished concrete floor. He stopped near the section where several fuel lines intertwined like metallic veins, noticing something no one else seemed to see. "Sensors lie when they're calibrated to the wrong parameters," Wilson remarked, his calm voice carrying decades of experience. "This engine is compensating for a failure the system doesn't even recognize as a failure." "Impossible." Duncan crossed his arms. "If there were an abnormal compensation, the alerts would have gone off." Wilson didn't answer right away. Instead, he crouched down, his joints clearly feeling the weight of the years, and examined the underside of the engine, where the auxiliary oil and fuel systems connected to the main structure. He stayed there for almost a full minute, analyzing something that apparently only he could see. "Mr. Wilson," Admiral Caldwell approached, his posture respectful in contrast to the engineer's impatience. "Would you share your assessment?" The veteran rose slowly, briefly steadying himself on the metal support of the engine. When he turned to face the group, there was absolute certainty in his eyes. "The 9th stage bleed valve is stuck partially open," Wilson explained, pointing to a specific section of the engine. "Not open enough to trigger the alarms, but just enough to cause a slight pressure loss that forces the control system to increase compressor speed to compensate. That creates a feedback loop the sensors read as normal operation, because technically it's still within limits, just constantly at the upper edge." The silence that followed was different from before. It was no longer disdain or impatience. It was genuine attention mixed with cautious skepticism. "With all due respect," Reynolds adjusted his glasses, "the 9th stage bleed valve has a dedicated monitoring system. We specifically checked that control line and—" "You checked the electronic signal," Wilson interrupted gently. "Not the physical valve. The actuator is reporting a closed position because the position sensor is working perfectly." but the valve stem is physically jammed by metallic debris that slipped past the filters during the last maintenance. The computer thinks everything's fine because the sensor says it is, but the valve isn't responding to the sensor. Duncan let out a short, incredulous laugh. Sir, that makes no sense. If there were debris in the system, it would have shown up in the oil contamination sensors. Not if the debris came from compressed air, not oil, Wilson replied calmly. A titanium shaving from the last compressor blade inspection. Too small to be filtered out, too hard to break apart, and just the right size to jam the valve stem when operational heat expands the metal by a few thousandths of an inch. The veteran walked over to a nearby workbench where tools were neatly arranged. Without asking permission, he grabbed a specific torque wrench and a small socket set. This is crazy. Reynolds looked at the Admiral. Sir, with all due respect, we can't just let him take apart critical components of a multi-million-dollar engine based on an unverified theory. Admiral Caldwell stood still for a long moment, his eyes shifting between the chief engineer and the veteran now returning to the engine with tools in hand. Through the open hangar doors, the USS Freedom was visible at the pier, its angular silhouette cutting against the ocean, glinting under the California afternoon sun. Mr. Wilson, the Admiral finally said, how long would you need to confirm your theory? 15 minutes to remove the access panel and reach the valve, Wilson replied without hesitation. Another 5 to confirm the diagnosis. And if you're wrong? Wilson met the Admiral's gaze with a calmness that only decades of experience could provide. Then you'll have lost 20 minutes, Admiral. But if I'm right, that engine will be running. The Admiral chuckled genuinely. Then proceed. Wilson carefully laid the tools on a mobile workbench beside the engine and began to work with precise, steady movements. As if the advanced Rolls-Royce MT-30 weren't a state-of-the-art machine, but rather an old companion from years gone by. Can someone hand me that LED flashlight? Wilson asked, pointing without taking his eyes off the panel he was beginning to remove. One of the young sailors hesitated, glancing at Reynolds as if for permission. The chief engineer gave a stiff nod, and the sailor quickly handed the flashlight to the veteran. As Wilson worked meticulously removing each screw from the access panel with the torque wrench set to the exact specification, Reynolds stood with his arms crossed, watching with a critical eye. Duncan and the third engineer, a middle-aged woman named Sarah Chen, exchanged skeptical looks, but remained silent. Admiral Caldwell stepped back a few paces, picking up his tablet to review the latest updates on the upcoming international mission. 48 hours. That was all they had. If the USS Freedom wasn't operational by then, the U.S. Navy would miss a crucial diplomatic deployment with Pacific allies, a failure that would echo far beyond that naval base. Once the panel was removed, Wilson leaned in to examine the exposed interior of the engine. The flashlight revealed a dense maze of tubing, wires, and mechanical components, so intricate it looked impossible to decipher. For the engineers watching, such a task demanded technical manuals, computer diagrams, and hours of systematic analysis. For Wilson, it was simple, very simple. Here, his fingers followed a specific fuel line until they reached a small actuator connected to a metal rod, the 9th stage bleed valve. He gently touched the component, feeling something his eyes couldn't see. The rod's definitely jammed, Wilson announced, his voice now firmer. There's abnormal resistance, about 20 thousandths of an inch blocked. Reynolds stepped forward, his curiosity finally overcoming his skepticism. That's impossible to feel by hand. The tolerance on that valve is 6 thousandths of an inch, Wilson finished without looking back. I know exactly what the tolerance is, son. And I also know that when you've worked with these machines long enough, your fingers learn to feel what instruments sometimes miss. He stepped back slightly and picked up a small precision Allen wrench from the workbench. I'm going to release the actuator's safety lock and try cycling the valve manually. If my theory's correct, I'll feel exactly where it's binding. If you force that valve and damage the mechanism, Duncan finally spoke up, we'll have to replace the entire module. That's a 6-week lead time and tens of thousands of dollars. I understand your concern, Wilson replied respectfully, but I'm not going to force anything. He returned to the engine. With movements almost surgical in their delicacy, Wilson released the actuator's safety lock and began to rotate it manually. His eyes closed again, every ounce of his focus drawn to the tactile feedback traveling from his fingertips to his mind. "There," he murmured after a few seconds. "Feel that?" He looked at Reynolds. "Put your hand on mine. I'll cycle it again." Reynolds hesitated, but one look from Admiral Caldwell was enough. The chief engineer stepped closer and cautiously placed his hand over Wilson's. The veteran repeated the slow movement, and this time Reynolds felt it. A faint resistance, an almost imperceptible point where the metal failed to slide as smoothly as it should. "I felt it," Reynolds admitted, his voice carrying genuine surprise. "Something's definitely blocking the full movement." "Exactly," Wilson said. "That's why the sensor reports full closure, because it's still within the sensor's margin of error, but mechanically, the valve isn't sealing completely." Duncan stepped closer too, his expression shifting from scorn to intense curiosity. "How did you even know where to look? There are dozens of valves in this engine, hundreds of possible failure points." Wilson straightened slowly, his back protesting from the strain of bending over. He wiped his hands with a cloth pulled from his pocket and looked at the young engineer with eyes that had seen decades of machines, wars, and lives. "Because I listened to the machine. I heard the sound. It wasn't the healthy growl it should have been. There was a wrong note, like a musician playing a symphony with one string just slightly out of tune. You diagnosed a multi-million-dollar engine by sound." The silence that followed was thick with dawning realization. Admiral Caldwell took a step forward, his eyes fixed on the veteran with renewed respect. "Mr. Wilson, you've worked with turbines before. Where exactly?" "Pratt & Whitney, Rolls-Royce, and General Electric," Wilson replied, his tone simple, but the weight of it was enormous. "Started as a junior mechanic. Retired as a senior consulting engineer for the propulsion systems developed for the Zumwalt and Freedom classes." He paused, his eyes softening as they rested on the engine before him. "This MT-30 here is practically my technical grandson. I recognize its voice the same way I'd recognize my own child's." Reynolds and Duncan stood frozen. The magnitude of what they had just heard sank in slowly. The old man they had mocked minutes earlier wasn't just another veteran. He was a living legend of naval engineering, a man whose knowledge had literally helped build the foundations of their entire careers. Admiral Caldwell stepped closer and placed a firm hand on Wilson's shoulder. "Mr. Wilson, I have to ask, why didn't you identify yourself right away? Why let my engineers doubt your ability?" Wilson turned his gaze back to the engine, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the metallic lines of the tubing. "Because identification doesn't fix engines, Admiral. Knowledge does. If I'd walked in here waving around my years of experience and past projects, you would have respected me for my title, not for my skill. But now you respect me because you've seen what I can do. And that, gentlemen and lady, is a much stronger foundation for trust." The wisdom in his words lingered in the air like something tangible. The younger sailors, who had been silently observing with growing respect, exchanged awed glances. Wilson returned to the engine, picking up his tools once more. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to remove this valve and fix the problem. I could do it alone, but it would be an honor to teach while I work. Anyone care to learn?" The response was immediate. They all stepped forward almost at once, their demeanor completely transformed. No longer skeptical superiors watching an old man, but eager students standing before a master. Wilson worked with the patience of a seasoned instructor, explaining each step of the process. "The fix is straightforward. Ultrasonic cleaning to remove the debris, borescope inspection to ensure no particles remain in the system, replacement of the sealing rings as a precaution, position sensor recalibration, and reinstallation. 4 hours of careful work." "4 hours," Admiral Caldwell repeated, glancing at his watch. "Still within schedule. Mr. Wilson, the United States Navy is in your debt." Wilson shook his head gently. "The Navy doesn't owe me a thing, Admiral. I owe the Navy. It gave me purpose, discipline, and the chance to serve something greater than myself. Everything I did here today was just paying back a small part of that debt." He began organizing the tools for the cleaning and reinstallation process, but Reynolds reached out and rested a hand lightly on his. "Mr. Wilson," the chief engineer said, his voice steady but respectful, "please allow us to handle the reinstallation under your supervision. You've already done the impossible. Let us learn by doing." Wilson looked at the engineers, and what he saw filled him with hope. The arrogance and doubt were gone, replaced by genuine humility and a hunger to learn. The next generation was finally ready to listen to the one before. "It would be an honor to supervise," Wilson said with a nod. The next 4 hours unfolded in a rhythm that blended technical urgency with quiet reverence. Wilson stood beside the workbench, his hands occasionally guiding but mostly observing, as the engineers carried out each step of the repair process under his precise supervision. "All systems nominal," Reynolds announced. "Pressure stabilized, airflow optimized, temperature within ideal parameters. The engine's perfect." Admiral Caldwell, who had remained present throughout the entire process, stepped forward and extended his hand to Wilson. "Mr. Wilson, I don't have the words to properly express my gratitude. You didn't just save this mission. You taught my team a lesson no school could ever offer." Wilson gripped the Admiral's hand firmly. "The gratitude's mine, Admiral. You gave me the chance to serve one more time. For an old sailor, there's no greater gift." And as he walked toward the courtyard where his grandson was marching with the other recruits, his silhouette framed against the California sunset, everyone who had witnessed that day knew they had experienced something rare, something deeply human. The USS Freedom departed just hours later, right on schedule, its engine running with the flawless precision that only the touch of experienced hands could ensure. And somewhere in San Diego, an 80-year-old veteran smiled, knowing he had served once more, not with strength or youth, but with something time could never diminish, the wisdom forged through a lifetime of unwavering dedication to his craft. If you enjoyed this story, click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next.